welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies and TV shows with history. Today, we are on part 2 of our 3-part miniseries covering the TV show called The Pinkertons. Now, if you haven't listened to the last episode, I would recommend you go back and do that because we started with episodes number 1 to 7 of the TV show, and today we're continuing with episodes number 8 to 14. Coming back to help us separate fact from fiction is Rob Hilliard, the author of In Freedom's Shadow, which is a wonderful historical novel that shines a light on some of the lesser-known characters from history that we get to see portrayed on screen in The Pinkertons. For example, how familiar are you with John Scoble? If that name doesn't ring a bell, then you're going to learn something new about American history today. And not to put a spoiler alert on the accuracy of the TV show, but if you want an even better story from American history than the TV show, hop in the show notes and get Rob book right now. But before we get Rob back on the line, let's set up our 2 truths and a lie game for today's episode. Now, if you're new to the show and this is your first episode of Based on a True Story, well, as you just heard, you happened upon the middle of a 3-part series. So I would recommend you go back and listen to part 1 of this series on the Pinkertons. You'll find a link to that in the show notes for your convenience. And thanks to the power of podcast apps that remember your location, I'll be right here when you get back. Are you back? Okay, then you've done one of these 2 truths and a lie game already. So here are the 3 facts for today's episode. Number 1, the Pinkertons did a lot of pro bono work in the 1860s. Number 2, traveling troops were a real thing in post-Civil War America. Number 3, Sterling Price was a real Confederate general in the Civil War. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is the lie, and I've got the answer tucked away in the envelope that we will open at the end of the episode to reveal and see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Rob Hilliard about episodes 8 to 14 of The Pinkertons. We'll start today with a very sensitive topic because episode number 8 of The Pinkertons addresses racism from white townspeople in Kansas City and Native Americans as the Pinkertons are trying to solve the murder of a Chippewa man. The show doesn't really portray any racism itself, but it is a sensitive line to walk because I think it's fair to say racism was definitely a thing in the 1800s, unfortunately still is today. Where did the Pinkertons stand when it came to injustice against Native Americans?
Well, specifically on their involvement with Native Americans, it would have been unless there was a Native who was a specific suspect in a case, they probably wouldn't have had any involvement as a company. And what I'm sure individual Pinkerton agents, as any individual person, would have their feelings, one way or another. As you said, certainly very strong racism against Native Americans, against Blacks, against Asians. The list goes on and on, right? At that time period, you're talking about basically just over a year after the last of the slaves were freed during the American Civil War. And certainly there had already been, as the Eastern U.S. was settled, the Trail of Tears, for example, with Cherokees, they were pushed out of southeastern United States in, I want to say that started around 1815, maybe 1820. So 40 plus years earlier. But it was about to get a whole lot worse as U.S. expansion started moving into the what we now know as the West or the prairies in the West. As we talked about in the last episode, Kansas City, Missouri at that time was just starting to be settled. But there were waves and waves of people coming right after the end of the Civil War. So again, without getting into a topic that's, could be a whole college course in itself, there was a very basic assumption that, I'll just say, white people, European settlers, were going to move in, dominate, push out people of color who lived in that area, whether they were Black, Asian, a lot of Chinese immigrants at the time. or just a bit later, I guess, not exactly at that time, but coming in through San Francisco, and then certainly Native Americans who were already there. Um, so all that is to say, certainly individual Pinkerton agents would have had their own positions, thoughts on things. But the company as a whole, and I couldn't even find, I did do some research on this. I couldn't find any specific cases where they were either working on behalf of a Native American tribe or pursuing a suspect who was Native American. That's not to say that those, don't exist or didn't happen, but I wasn't able to find anything through the resources that I had available. So
maybe kind of what you were talking about in the last episode, where is about the money, and whoever's going to pay and be their client, that's who their client is.
yeah, that's exactly right. They were very the Pinkertons were very mission focused, and they were very success focused, and ultimately that equated to at that time being very dollar focused. And yeah, you're exactly right. They would have been. Um, it would be less likely that they would be working on behalf of the Native Americans, just because they would be less likely to have the money to pony up to pay for things at that time. Um, Again, not to say that they didn't have a specific case like that, but I'm not aware of it. Um, but then equally on the other side, like I said, unless there was a suspect who happened to be Native American, I don't think that the company as a whole um, probably devoted much thought or interest to it other than how it affected their bottom line.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Well, in the last episode, we talked some about John Bell or John Scoble. And if we go back to the series in episode 9, we get to learn a little bit more about his backstory, according to the series at least, because there's an investigation into another murder, and that suspect turns out to be an old friend of John Bell. And that leads us into learning more about his background. The Pinkertons find out that the house they're paying rent for, Kate's house in the series, is owned by KC Holdings number 6107, which is actually owned by John Bell. So when he's confronted, John says he grew up in New York City. He was brought under the protection of a lady named Marm. And then when the episode suspect, Aldred, and John Bell were kids, they were on the street, Marm took them in and gave them a quote-unquote family in exchange for them stealing for her. So this episode is him kind of breaking free from her and his own past. And of course, as you mentioned earlier in our last episode, the John Bell is John Scoble. So how well does this episode kind of portray the background for what we know of the real John Scoble?
Not even remotely close. And what it does do an excellent job of, though, is stealing the plot of Oliver Twist, because it's exactly what, I mean, tweaked a little bit to shorten it for TV, but this is the plot of Oliver Twist. And with Marm, the title character of the show, being the Fagin character. And so from my standpoint, this is not only poor history, it's poor writing, sloppy writing. But yeah, it's not close. Scoble, we talked about this a bit in the last episode, but Scoble was a slave. He was born a slave. Prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, he lived in Mississippi. He was on the plantation of a man named oh, doggone it, I forgot his first name. I should know it, but anyway, his name was Scoble, and so of course, like many escaped slaves, he took his master's surname. So yeah, I mean, the story couldn't be more different. Scoble ultimately escaped, met the Pinkertons, was recruited as a Pinkerton agent. So for anybody listening to the episode here, you'll notice there's not one piece of what I'm talking about that remotely ties into what we saw in the episode. Which is unfortunate because, again, when this one sort of started up and they started into the episode and they were talking more about John Bell, I'm like, oh boy, here we go. And then it seemed like they were going to get into his past, and I'm like, wow, this is going to be, somehow aligned with the book that my story is about, or the story that my book is about, excuse me. And yeah, it wasn't even. I mean, there was really no part of it that that aligned with what we know about his backstory. So, like I said, it was disappointing from a historical standpoint, but it was equally disappointing just from a a writing standpoint because I'm like, this is just Oliver Twist. What?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess I didn't even make that connection that, just Oliver Twist in another form.
Exactly.
Well, the last time we talked, we covered episode number 3 with a traveling troupe in Kansas City. And we see another troupe coming in episode number 10. But this time, it is different because it's a boxing circuit this time. We see Henry, the Iron Fist Fox, fighting against Bert the Butcher Grove. And it turns out Henry Fox is an old flame of Kate Warren's. So that's how the Pinkertons get involved in this episode's murder. Since this is the second time in the series we have this concept of traveling troops come up, it makes me think that the TV show is using them as a means to get new characters into the show so they can just get rid of them after a single episode. Once their part is done, they can leave. It also makes me think of how local law enforcement today, like the police handle local crimes, while federal crimes go to the FBI. Of course, the FBI didn't exist in the timeline of the series. So that makes me wonder if then the Pinkertons almost work similar in a way that the FBI does today with local law enforcement. In the series, it's Sheriff Logan. He's handling these local crimes. And maybe that's why the Pinkertons are handling crimes associated with traveling troops, because they're not the locals. Is it true that the traveling troops kept the Pinkertons as busy as we see them in the series?
Well, definitely not. But there is a seed of truth in there. Well, 2 seeds maybe. So one is there were definitely traveling troops. They were a big thing at that time period. The country was starting to it had just come out of a 4-year war, and of course, the war was internal to our boundaries, so that limited people's mobility in and of itself. Not to mention the fact that there was a war going on and people were focused on that and not other things. But at the close of the war, a couple things had happened. More railroads had been built as part of the war effort, or extended. More roads had been built or extended. So, as they show in the Pinkertons show, the wagon trains and things were kind of moving. There was increased mobility, and they were starting to enter into an era of more prosperity and that westward expansion that I talked about a minute ago. And so you did see these traveling troops, and sometimes they were boxers, sometimes they were actors, like we talked about in the previous episode. There were religious revivalists that traveled around the country like that. And then you had the shysters, fortune tellers or, snake oil salesmen, whatever. But those things were all real. Did they travel around and murder each other when they got to each city? No, it would have been a pretty short trip, right? Because once you kill all the people involved in your show, you don't have anything left. So that wasn't really a thing. But the other piece in the law enforcement that you latched onto there is a key distinction as we're talking about, because virtually all law enforcement at that time was local. And even most cities didn't have a detective force. Some did. New York City did in I think the 1850s, and there might have been a couple others, like really 1 or 2 others. But most of them just had like what we would call today a beat cop, right? A force of those, and they were exclusively men. But there was no national, there was no FBI. Secret Service was formed in 1865. Oddly, they didn't really have a presidential protection element at that time as much as they were an anti-counterfeiting organization, because counterfeiting was a huge deal at the time. And that was something that the Pinkertons did get involved in, that the series somehow failed to latch onto. But anyway, but what was happening with that mobility is 2 things. People would travel. Crime travels with people, right? Good and bad people travel. But the other thing is that there was a breakdown in jurisdictions. So if you were the sheriff of such and such a county, or the fictional sheriff of Kansas City, Missouri, and a crime was committed just outside of the town. Actually, a really good example of this is a show that I know a movie that you've covered on your show before, which is Tombstone. And there's a part in there where there's a shooting with the cowboys, and the county sheriff, whose name I suddenly can't remember now. I can picture the actor, but anyway, he says, no, this is a city matter. And so he pushes it off onto the Earps to deal with. That wasn't even a real thing because they were actually U.S. Marshals. It's a whole, anyway. But the point is, there were all these little jurisdictional disputes. But when you started looking at like a railroad robbery, for example, well, if that railroad runs from, I don't know, Ohio to North Dakota, and the crime is committed somewhere along there, right? And somebody jumps on the train in Minnesota and robs it. Well, who has jurisdiction over that? Is it the police force from the city, Columbus, Ohio, where it left from? Or is it the police in Deadwood, North Dakota, Deadwood, North or South Dakota, whatever, Fargo, North Dakota? Or is it Duluth, Minnesota, where the crime was committed? Like, they couldn't figure out those things. And so the Pinkertons actually, and really where they made their bones to a large extent, was they had that national presence, or grew into it, and they were just starting to get it right after the Civil War. But they were able to take a warrant from, the governor of such and such a state and pursue a criminal across state lines because they had no fixed geographic jurisdiction. And so then if they caught that person, and there are specific examples where they had a writ from, let's say, the governor of Indiana, and they pursued somebody and they captured them in Illinois, they would hold them and then wire back to the governor of Indiana, to the governor of Illinois, and they would basically rewrite the writ for Illinois, and then they could arrest that person and bring them in. So sorry, that's kind of convoluted, but the point being, they had the ability to be overarching because they didn't have, they were getting paid either reward money or acting, as a government contractor in effect. So they were paid by those states where the crimes were committed, but then they could chase people anywhere they wanted to. So
it's not like they didn't have jurisdiction. And so because they didn't have jurisdiction, they had jurisdiction everywhere, basically.
Exactly. They had it where they decided they have it. But that was to the benefit of crime enforcement, not just to the benefit of the Pinkertons, but there were cases where prior to that, where somebody was arrested and they would get off because it's like, well, you can't arrest me because, you're the sheriff of this county and I actually committed the crime in this neighboring county. And they would be like, oh yeah, you're right. We can't hold you. And they take the handcuffs off and walk away. So, that was a problem. And which is why ultimately, eventually the FBI, came into existence, because there needed to be some mechanism to address that. So, the one other thing I wanted to come back to for a second, I mentioned this in the last episode, but talking about the traveling troops, this is what I call the Gunsmoke approach to TV writing, right? Where you build one set in one place, and then you find some mechanism in your writing to bring the bad guys to you. And then, as you said, they also then pack up and leave conveniently at the end of the show. So they're not hanging around. Like, I don't have to explain their presence, 4 episodes from now, because they got in their wagon and got on down the road, or got on the train and got on down the road. So.
Well, we even see that in the next episode of the series, episode 11, and because there's another traveling troupe that comes through. This time, though, it's spiritualists called Doc Sprague's Traveling Spiritualism Show. And the episode focuses on a woman named Mio. The guy who runs the show claims that she's a seer of spirits, but we quickly find out that she's a Japanese lady who's being forced to participate in the show until she can make her escape to a handsome man in St. Louis who has promised her marriage and a wonderful life. And then when she shows Will the photo of the man in St. Louis that she's going to be marrying, Will recognizes the photo, and it's General George Armstrong Custer. In other words, Mio has been duped. There's no promise of marriage. She's been sold by the spiritualism show. So, of course, the Pinkertons intervene to stop this from happening. Basically, it seems like a case of human trafficking that the Pinkertons are managing to stop. And remembering that this is all happening right after the Civil War, I'm sure that the character of Mio is probably fictional, but the concept of human trafficking, even after the end of the war, I'm sure is true. Were the Pinkertons involved in fighting against human trafficking?
In the way that I guess you're intending to pose the question, I think the answer is no. And that is to say, first of all, the concept of human trafficking as we think about it today would have been very different and very foreign to that time period. As you said, we're talking about being, a year or so removed from the end of the Civil War. And even though a lot of people might be, familiar with the Emancipation Proclamation, that only freed slaves within the Confederacy and then only within the areas basically where the Union soldiers moved into the Confederacy, because otherwise, obviously, the Confederacy didn't feel like they had to follow the laws of the United States. So
they'd already left the country anyway. Why were they going to follow the country's laws?
Do whatever you want. We're not going to do that. We're not going to follow that. So the Emancipation Proclamation on paper freed the slaves. In reality, the last of the slaves, which is what Juneteenth is about, weren't freed until really after the end of the war, but in 1865. So we're very close to that in time at the time of the series. And so it wouldn't be, sad to say, a foreign concept that somebody being kept in some form of bondage, right? On the show, she's not in physical bondage, but in effect, she is. And there's certainly many examples of that, even much later in the 19th century. Well, obviously, there's examples of it today in a different way, but people who are immigrants brought to the United States, and then subjugated in some way, kept in a way where they couldn't just pick up and move and didn't have freedom that we would associate with being a citizen. And that took a lot of forms, but it wouldn't have been something that the Pinkertons would be involved in, and very similar to what we talked about. We were talking about the Native Americans in the first part of this show. If it didn't pay the bills, it wouldn't have been something they were looking into. And again, that sounds harsh, but that is the reality that I'm sure there were individual agents who maybe ran into situations like that and may have even taken it into their own hands and done something about it, possibly. I'm not aware of that one way or the other, but it wouldn't have been something that as an agency or as a company that they would be directly intervening the way we saw in that episode.
I guess it's kind of like what we were talking about, where they're not law enforcement. So it's a fine line. Like they're almost law enforcement, but they're not. And so it is about the money. So it's not, see a crime, solve the crime. It's, get paid to solve the crime, basically.
No, that's a good way to say it. And the show repeatedly, blurred that line, but it wasn't. They were, and it said even in some of their advertising at the time, detectives for hire. And I'm kind of underlining the for hire part when I say that, but to your point, they weren't just sort of roaming around solving mysteries or crimes, out of the goodness of their heart. They were doing it because somebody hired them to specifically do something. So, yeah,
like we think of a private investigator today.
Exactly.
They're not doing it just for the fun of it. They're doing it because they're getting paid to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, if we head back to the TV show in episode number 12, we learn about 4 nurses in the Civil War who reunite in Kansas City, conveniently, of course, after they experienced this horrible, what they call the Battle of Big Sheep 2 years earlier. And they try to pay someone off $2,000 to keep them quiet. But then later, the guy that they paid off ends up dead. One of the ladies admits to it, saying that she just wanted to keep their secret quiet. According to the show, their secret is that the 4 women were nurses at a hospital at the Battle of Big Sheep. And for weeks on end, the Union General Hunt, according to this show, sent the soldiers to take Big Sheep Hill from the Confederates, despite being outnumbered. The officers tried to convince Hunt that the battle was pointless. The hill had no strategic value. And they mentioned some like 5,000 soldiers were lost because of Hunt's insistence on taking the hill. So when Hunt came to the hospital injured, the nurses decided just to leave him untreated, basically, they let him die because in their minds, they were saving thousands of men by letting one man die. And that's their secret. Is there any truth to this story of General Hunt and the Battle of Big Sheep?
None. And this was kind of, I don't remember what episode number was this again?
This is episode number 12.
12. Okay. So it was almost midway through the series or just over. And this is where I got to the point where I was watching these with my wife and I'm like, okay, this is the biggest eye roll so far. And I started to really, almost kind of get off the bus with the whole concept of the series. Nothing of that is, again, remotely close. You've heard me say that about other episodes before, but it is so far outside of the realm of reality that I'm just like, oh my gosh, this doesn't even make sense. So just to give you a couple of statistics, well, first off, just to hit it head on, no such person, no such battle. And you said the key thing there that they talked about it going on for weeks. I don't know if they were specific, but they said that it went for weeks. Most of the Civil War battles, actually most of them were a day. A couple were longer. Gettysburg, just to give a good example, was 3 days. And that was the single bloodiest battle overall. Now you'll often hear it quoted that Antietam was the bloodiest day in American history. That's the bloodiest single day because the Battle of Antietam only lasted 1 day, effectively. And so I'll give you some statistics here in a minute, but my main point was there were not Civil War battles that lasted for weeks where they were repeatedly trying to take one hill. There were some, like the Peninsula Campaign, where McClellan was trying to take Richmond in 1862, where there were like repeated battles as they were moving along a long, 70 or 80 mile stretch and progressing. And there were repeated battles or multiple battles day after day. But each of those have like their own name and their own objectives when they were fighting the battle. And so this idea of like trying to take a hill repeatedly, it just didn't exist. And I'm going to come back to that. So, but let me give you some statistics first. So in the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg, the total number of Union dead was only 3,200 people, 3,200 soldiers. The Confederate total was 3,900. At Antietam, the Union lost 2,100 dead, and the Confederates about 1,600 dead. Now, I certainly don't want to minimize those numbers because, all those people were humans. They all mattered, right? But nothing near 5,000 dead on one side, like they talked about in the episode. And if there were a battle that lasted for weeks and 5,000 soldiers on one side or the other were killed, we would know the name of it, like we know Gettysburg or Antietam or Chickamauga or any of the bloodier battles of the war, right? We would already know about it. So, like I said, I really started getting, annoyed watching this. And then when they got to the end and revealed what their secret was, as you said, that they basically left the, was he a general? I can't remember what it is.
I think they gave as a general, but they didn't really mention anything other than that, what major general, lieutenant, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this was the same when it finished and the credits were rolling. I turned to my wife and I said, they stole that plot from an episode of MASH. There was an episode of MASH. Again, I'm showing my age here. But there was an episode of MASH where Hawkeye Pierce, if anybody hasn't seen it, he was the main doctor in there, and it's set in Korea, where he operates on an officer. I didn't look it up. I'm just going from memory, but I'm going to say he was a colonel. But same concept. He was a guy who was repeatedly leading people, trying to, and they did have battles there that lasted for days or weeks. And I can't tell you the casualty numbers, but where they were trying to take a single hill, right? Korea, Vietnam, that more fits that story. But the episode of MASH, Hawkeye removes a healthy appendix from this doctor or from this officer, and so that he's in the hospital and can't lead his troops on another attack of this hill. So same concept, and again, I'm like, as a student of history, I'm looking at it, I'm like, this is all wrong. And when they got to the end, as a writer, I'm like, they just stole this from another, like we talked about the other episode, they just lifted it from something else. So I don't know if they did that, we're cognizant of the fact that they did it or not, or if it was just incidental, but yeah, anybody wants to go look up that episode of MASH. I have no idea what it's called or anything like that, but I do remember watching it 40 years ago. So.
And things like that, like we don't see any of that in the Pinkertons. We don't see any of the actual battle itself. They only talk about it. And so it's just in the dialogue, which means you can change that very easily and still have a similar concept of, these nurses that are killing one lot, instead of 5,000, right? But you don't have to say 5,000. You can say something a little more historically accurate.
Right. Well, and that's what really started to annoy me was, they didn't have to be, it didn't have to be that far off, right? I mean, as I said a minute ago, if you're talking about, let's say the Union dead at Gettysburg, 3,200, that's a tragic loss of human life. And so it's almost like somebody in some writer's room was looking at it and they said, well, it's, 1,500 people. That doesn't sound like enough. Let's make it 3,000. That doesn't sound like enough either. Let's make it 5,000. Okay, 5,000 it is, and like I said, that's sloppy history and sloppy writing. So to me, it doesn't bode well on either front.
Maybe it's just me, or maybe it was because in an earlier episode they showed they had a picture of Custer. When I heard the name of this one, the Battle of Big Sheep, I was like, oh, they're trying to say Little Bighorn, basically.
I had the same reaction. It's funny you said that, because when it first popped up, I'm like, well, that's weird. Little Bighorn wasn't, it was 10 years. It wasn't anything like that. Maybe there's somehow, but it was, it was.
Yeah, and then it wasn't that either.
Exactly.
Well, the case in this episode is interesting because it starts when Will Pinkerton just happens to be at the saloon when one of the nurses gives the guy at the bar an envelope full of cash, and Will just happens to notice it. And in some of the other episodes, we've seen the Pinkertons get cases by being hired by the governor, local law enforcement. Sometimes it's private citizens. Sometimes it's things like this where they just seem to notice something is awry, and so they step in to make things right, kind of like with this episode. So that would make me assume that the Pinkertons maybe did some pro bono work. How well does the series do showing the various ways that the Pinkertons got their cases?
And some of those are accurate. I don't think they did any pro bono work. Again, not that I'm aware of. They were all about bringing in the buck. But as far as how assignments came to them, it was often that there was a crime of some sort, and then, as I've said earlier, like maybe a train robbery, so the railroad company would reach out to them, and they became like the de facto, or I'm sorry, the default, the go-to company, specifically for train robberies. In fact, talk about another movie here for a second, based on a true story, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. At the end of that, they are pursued, but they're not called Pinkertons. I forget the name they use in Butch Cassidy, but they, in real life, they were the Pinkertons that were chasing their gang. And I think that was it the Hole in the Wall gang? I want to say. Doesn't matter. But anyway.
It's been a while since I've seen that. I'd have to go back and look it up to make sure.
Same here. But anyway. But that really did happen, and the Pinkertons really did, pursue them and break that gang. And they were known for like never giving up. We talked in the first episode about how they ultimately broke the Reno gang, who committed the first and one of many, but the first train robbery in the U.S. And the Pinkertons ultimately caught them. So they had this reputation of just to steal from the Mounties. We always get our man. And also, as they had in their advertisement with the all-seeing eye on it, the Pinkerton eye, it said, "We never sleep." And they really cultivated that image purposefully. And to the extent that, a little bit of trivia here, the term private eye that we use today is actually derived from the Pinkerton all-seeing eye logo.
Oh, okay.
That was Alan Pinkerton, I suspect probably behind his back. They used to call him the Eye because he was, the founder of the company, and I think the one who came up with the logo, or at least the one who blessed it. And so that they would call him the Eye. But anyway, that became known as private detective transmogrified into private eye from that logo. So that's where the term comes from. But so they did get, again, train companies reached out to them, express companies that were moving stuff that got robbed, banks, obviously. And then there were instances, and this comes back to what we talked about a minute ago about jurisdictions where state governors would reach out to the Pinkertons because they didn't have a law enforcement agency that fit the right jurisdiction for a particular item, or they knew the criminal had left and gone across to another state, and that the Pinkertons could cover that ground. So that wouldn't have been at all unusual. It wouldn't have been totally unusual either for a Pinkerton agent to be in a bar and to see something and have it kind of like a modern, let's say, a detective on, I live near Pittsburgh. So the Pittsburgh police force, one of their detectives is in a bar and see somebody hand somebody an envelope full of money. That's going to immediately trigger the fire senses, right? So they might look into it and check into it and maybe see who that person is or what might be going on or investigate a little bit further, but they're not going to take that all the way to its conclusion without a sponsor, without a client.
I wonder if some of that, the concept of them never stopping, comes from that jurisdiction, because I could see it from the criminal's perspective. If you're used to, once you get out of the law enforcement jurisdiction, you're free. And I'm thinking of, again, another movie, Bonnie and Clyde. Like when they cross state lines, the cop cars just turn around and leave. It's not their jurisdiction anymore. But the Pinkertons can do that, and they can keep going no matter where they are. So I wonder if that helped feed into that sense, from the other side, like, oh, they're never going to stop. They're going to keep coming.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And even taking that a step further, I said a minute ago that Alan Pinkerton and the agency cultivated that idea, right? But part of the reason they cultivated it was to instill that fear in the criminals. And there was no worse news than, let's say about 1870 or so, he's saying, oh, I committed a crime. And they're like, yeah, the Pinkertons are after you. Like that is, you could not get any worse news than that, because you knew that they would, exactly to your point, like there's not a safe place as long as I'm in the United States, right? And again, back to Butch Cassidy's Sundance Kid, that's why they leave and go to Bolivia, because that was the only place they could go to get away. And really, as the Pinkertons went on over time, even getting outside the boundaries of the U.S. wouldn't be enough, because they would start pursuing people internationally.
Well, the title of episode number 13 is called Frontier Desperados. It's named after a dime novel of the same name that we see in that episode. And according to the show, the woman in the book is courageous enough to pass on that courage to the woman reading it. Her name is Belle Carson in this episode. And her husband, though, insists that Frontier Desperados is a fool and all women should just do what they're told. As I was watching that part of the episode as a reminder of how bad sexism was back then, and even though today as well, unfortunately, but even though it's not really in the series here, I couldn't help but think then about Kate Warren, who, as a woman in the Old West, had to face her own, I'm sure, share of, misogyny and sexism. Can you explain what sexism was like in the Old West and how it affected the real Kate Warren?
Well, first of all, I probably can't fully explain what sexism was like in the Old West,
Well,
being neither a woman nor having lived there. But
fair point.
But to try to answer your question, it was about what we would think, I guess is probably the best way to say it, which is to say that women were minimalized. I mean, they weren't allowed to vote until 1919, I think it was, but well into the 20th century. There were places in the country where women didn't have property rights. That wasn't everywhere, but So even at a, not even a person-to-person perception of sexism, but what's the term I'm looking for here? Built into the system. I'm struggling.
Like a society, like the whole society.
Yeah, institutional sexism was absolutely, a reality of that time. And of course, it wasn't recognized as that in large part because that was the societal norm, and it took decades until those things started to change. So Kate Warren certainly did experience that, and the example that I'll kind of use to tell that story is when she first applied to the Pinkerton agency or directly down Pinkerton, which was like 1855, and said, "I would like to be a detective," and his immediate response was, "No, you're a woman." And so she kind of repeatedly, came back and said, "I think I'd be good at it. And here's why." And what ultimately opened his eyes, and I've said some bad things about Alan Pinkerton over the course of these the shows here, but he must have been to an extent open-minded, at least uh, to the point of being able to further his business, right? Because he recognized after some explanation that, you know what, if we bring in a female detective, and this is the point that Kate made to him, was she said, I can go into places that no male detective can ever go into. Meaning she could go places, and there were instances over the years where a man committed a crime and she went to his wife and sat down one-on-one with her and said, listen, you really need to tell him to turn himself in. And here's why. And so she talked the wife into doing it, and the wife in turn and talked the criminal into doing it. And those were the kind of points that she was making to Alan Pinkerton at the outset. But it took some convincing. And in the show, The Pinkertons, we see several times places where Kate comes in and, whoever the person is, whether they're a bad guy or just a, character, and they're like, who are you? You're some woman, get out of here. That would have been a very real reaction at that time. Women were not respected, at least respected in that environment for having sort of the guts and the toughness and the knowledge and the smarts to be able to carry out those types of assignments. So that would have been very much a real thing. The other point that I wanted to make, sorry, just one quick aside on that. One thing that's shown multiple times, but I felt like it got more as they went through the episodes, was Kate going into the saloon and in the first floor of the hotel and drinking beer at the bar. That would be a hard no in the 1800s. A woman, unless she was a woman employed by the bar for certain purposes, would be, let's say, a woman of a respected woman. I'm struggling to come up with the right terms here, but would A, not go into a saloon, and B, certainly not go in and go up to the bar and have a beer. Beer was in public was considered to be a male drink, a male, that was a male domain. And if you were there, you were a floozy of some sort or another. So, again, another thing I kind of got a chuckle out of as the show went on. Another thing I wanted to go back to about this episode, though, is, and again, when it started, I thought, ooh, okay, this is where they're going. But I think Belle Carson was intended to be Belle Starr, who is a notorious, probably the most notorious female outlaw of that time period. And so I just want to make sure I don't know her story as well, so I wrote down some notes here. But she did live in Missouri. She was born in, I think it was Springfield, but she lived in that area. And she was associated with the James Younger gang, which is Frank and Jesse James and Cole Younger. And I know we're going to talk about that a bit later, but there is a theory that Cole Younger was actually the father of Belle Starr's oldest daughter. So they were together at some point. So there is a connection there between Bellstar and Jesse James, or the James Younger gang. And like I said, when that started, I thought, oh, this must be where I had known a little bit about that connection. I didn't know that Bellstar was from Missouri, or close to Kansas City, Missouri. But that was not at all where they were going, and I didn't even, get around to touching on that. So again, I thought they were going to have some historical, at least a spinoff from a historical, accuracy standpoint, but they veered off.
Well, I think the crime in this episode was a kidnapping, and we do see Jesse James. So there was a little bit of a connection. Of course, he does show up later in the series too, not to get too far ahead, but is the show correct then to suggest that the Pinkertons chased Jesse James?
Yes, absolutely. And this is there have been actually multiple books written about it, and movies made about it. So to try and keep this as short as possible, because again, this could be, a long, yeah. The Pinkertons absolutely pursued Jesse James. It wasn't in this time period. It wasn't until about 10 years later. Now he was active, him and I mentioned already the James Younger gang, as they called it. They were already robbing banks and, I think probably robbing trains, in the 1860s, but the Pinkertons weren't brought in. Again, they had it wasn't like they were just going to go after him because he was doing bad things. So they were ultimately hired in 1874. So almost 10 years after the time period of the show, to start to pursue Jesse James. And that pursuit went on for years. And they never caught him. That was one of the most famous, if not the most famous, failures of the Pinkerton agency. And there weren't all that many, but that became, like I said, probably the most famous. Another thing to note there is, during that pursuit, there was a Pinkerton agent named, I want to make sure I get his name right here. I thought I wrote it down, but maybe I didn't. Oh, here it is. Louis Lull, Lull. In 1874, he was killed by the James Younger gang, probably two of the Younger brothers. That's Younger with a capital Y. And so they killed him while he was on assignment as a Pinkerton agent chasing after the gang. And so Alan Pinkerton, who by this point was maybe 60 years old, actually went out in the field himself. He was enraged by it and joined in the chase for Jesse James. And then the following year, and I don't think Alan Pinkerton was hands-on involved with this, but there was a very now infamous incident and tragic incident where the Pinkertons had gotten bad information, but they got information that Jesse was in their family farmhouse. And so they went in with some deputies and some volunteers. The Pinkertons moved in, closed around the place, and they ended up, someone from the Pinkertons ended up tossing like a grenade, an incendiary device into the house, and the house burned. And tragically, they killed Jesse and Frank's much younger half-brother. He was a boy, I maybe around 10 years old. I can't remember exactly how old. And they pretty badly injured their mother. Her arm was badly burned in that incident. So anyway, those are a couple, anybody who digs into that story at all, those are some incidents that they'll hear about that were kind of flashpoints throughout the search for Jesse James. But as most people know, I don't think I'm spoiling this, Jesse was ultimately killed by a member of his own gang, and the Pinkertons never caught him. And but that was, like I said, that pursuit went on for, I'm going to say, at least 2 years and might have even been a bit longer than that, but they were never able to successfully catch him.
Wow. Yeah, I got the impression that, you mentioned the timeline being different. I get the impression that everybody knows who Jesse James is, so we got to put him on the show somehow.
And I think there's some truth to that. And I think there's also kind of like people who know a little bit more about history are like, oh yeah, there's some association with the Pinkertons and Jesse James, right? Like vaguely connected in their head. So when they present this, they're like, oh yeah, okay, this makes perfect sense. But the reality is it was, not even, the timeline is off. The incidents are off. The whole thing's off. So.
Getting that sense for a lot of the episodes on the show.
Fortunately.
Well, if we circle back to the TV show, speaking of, we've got one more episode to talk about today, and that is episode number 14 called Old Pap. And that refers to a Confederate general named Sterling Price who arrives in Kansas City to set up a newspaper that he calls the Kansas City Guardian. And he starts printing about the oppression of the government restricting our freedoms and other things that sound eerily similar to what people are complaining about even today. But General Price takes it to the next level because he says the Civil War had an unjust end and he is openly trying to start the Civil War again. Of course, our heroes in the show, the Pinkertons, come to save the day and the nation. So this is kind of a two-part question. Was General Price a real person who was basically trying to start Civil War version 2.0? And was it really the Pinkertons who stopped that from happening?
The answer to your first question there is yes, kind of. And the answer to the second question is absolutely no. The Pinkertons had nothing to do with it. But Sterling Price was I think a brigadier general for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Since we're now making pop culture references to other movies, I'll give you another one. If you've seen True Grit, which is not based on a true story, but
it's two versions of that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I only acknowledge the earlier one, but that one version. But Rooster Cogburn was a Confederate soldier, as he talks about in the movie, but his cat's name is General Sterling Price.
Oh, okay.
And so he, well, anyway, I could easily veer off and talk for an hour about True Grit, but I won't. But anyway, so yeah, Sterling Price was a real person. He was certainly, vehemently, vehement supporter of the Confederacy, vehement supporter of slavery. And at the end of the war, he did refuse to surrender like the other Confederate generals did, but he didn't travel around the country. Instead, he left and went to Mexico. And when he was there, it was a relatively short period, maybe a year. They tried to establish a new, basically Confederate colony or Southern colony in Mexico, and kind of bring some of the people who didn't want to live in the U.S. under the non-Confederate rule, and bring them down there. That basically failed. He got sick with typhoid. So he left there, came back. He was from Missouri. Actually, he was governor of Missouri from 1853 to 1857. So prior to the war. And then he was also Missouri's congressman from 1845 to 1846 in the House of Representatives. So he was a very well-known figure and a Missourian by birth. So he did come back to Missouri in 1867, I believe it was. But he was basically penniless at that point. He didn't have supporters like it showed in the show. And he wasn't printing a newspaper or any of those things. He basically, as it turned out, came home there to die. So the only other seed of truth in that whole thing is that he did die of cholera. I feel pretty confident in saying that, as they suggested in the show, he was not poisoned with cholera by John Scoble. I'm pretty sure that wasn't real. But anyway, yeah, so very much a real person. To the extent that I could find out, and I did dig into this a little bit, never any association with the Pinkertons.
Just another name from history that they're pulling into.
Yeah, to kind of tie in. So actually, I was a little bit surprised that they picked somebody who had an association with Missouri. Usually
Yeah,
they
they
were
actually
so
got it
far
right.
off in left field. Like I was surprised they didn't pick somebody who, I don't know, lived in Florida or something.
Maybe it was an accident. Maybe they didn't know it was Michigan.
They may not. Yeah, good point.
Well, we're up to episode number 14. It's the perfect stopping point for today. We've still got another 8 episodes left in the series to talk about next time. But let's take one more overall look back from episodes number 8 to 14 that we talked about today. Was there anything we didn't get a chance to talk about, that how they portrayed history, that really kind of stood out to you?
No, I think we kind of hit the high points. I mean, again, it seemed to be, and you just said it a second ago, it seemed to be kind of the MO of the show to just take a name or like in the case of Belle Starr, they just did a first name. I'm not sure why they didn't use her full name or regular name. And then just sort of reinvent a story around that. Which, as I said, when we recorded our first episode, made for good entertainment at times. I don't want to give the impression that the show wasn't enjoyable or that people shouldn't watch it, because, it was good fun at times. But yeah, from a historical accuracy standpoint, I gave it a D when we started out here. Now, as I'm talking through all this stuff, I'm thinking I might have to lower that grade. But yeah, no, I think we've hit most of the important points.
Okay, well, thank you again so much for coming on and chat about the Pinkertons. We'll be back next time to finish up the whole series, looking at episodes number 15 to 22. But in the meantime, for the listening audience at home, I would highly recommend you hop in the show notes, pick up Rob's book called In Freedom's Shadow. So before I let you go today, Rob, can you give listeners a little teaser of your book?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity. So the book is, we've talked a little bit here about John Bell / John Scoble. The book is based on the true story of John Scoble, who was a slave who escaped Mississippi, who lived in Mississippi at the outbreak of the Civil War, escaped and made his way to Washington, D.C. And there he was recruited by Alan Pinkerton to become a spy and part of Pinkerton's spy network for the Union Army. And he was sent back into the Confederacy on at least 2 clandestine missions that we know of. So that's the basis of the book. And unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot more about the real life story. So, as I jokingly say to people, if I just wrote that part, it would be about 5 pages. So you're holding the book up there. It's a little thicker than 5 pages.
Just a little bit, yeah.
So, yeah. So, basically I made up the rest, but, it's tries to fill in the blanks in that story and hopefully tell it in an entertaining way that people can enjoy.
And a lot more accurately than the Pinkertons. As much. Well, thank you again so much for your time.
Appreciate it.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Rob Hilliard once again for taking the time to help us separate fact from fiction in episodes 8 to 14 of the Pinkertons. And we'll have Rob back on the podcast again to finish up our mini-series on the TV show. But in the meantime, be sure to check out Rob's historical novel called In Freedom's Shadow. As Rob talked about, In Freedom's Shadow is a historical novel centered around a little-known person in history who we should all learn a little more about, John Scoble. Hop in the show notes right now to grab your copy, or as always, you can find a link to it on the show's home on the web at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/361. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie again. Number 1, the Pinkertons did a lot of pro bono work in the 1860s. Number 2, traveling troops were a real thing in post-Civil War America. Number 3, Sterling Price was a real Confederate general in the Civil War. Did you figure out which one is a lie? Got the answer right here. So let's open that up. And the lie is number 1. Rob pointed out that even though the TV show suggests the Pinkertons were okay with doing pro bono work to right the wrongs of injustice, in reality, the Pinkertons were a company. They were all about making profits, and so, like any company, they were hired for their work, and their standard operating procedure had nothing to do with working for free. If you've made it this far, you are one of the superfans of Based on a True Story. Check out the show notes for links to the free weekly email newsletter that I've been ramping up again lately, as well as where you can leave comments in the Discord community. Or you can always reach out to me directly at dan@basedonatruestorypodcast.com if you want to share an idea for a future episode, or just want to share what you've been watching lately and want to talk about historical movies and TV shows. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Rob and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.